All right, so I am going to begin now. Thank you everybody for coming out for today's event, France and Africa. There are several things that I would like to say before we officially begin. The first of which is that the Syracuse University College of Arts and Sciences would like to acknowledge with respect the Onondaga Nation, firekeepers of the Haudenosaunee, the indigenous peoples on whose ancestral land Syracuse University now stands. And furthermore, I'd like to talk a bit about the Africa Initiative. So the Africa Initiative of Syracuse University is a campus-wide project housed in the Department of African American Studies within the College of Arts and Sciences. Its purpose is to focus on Africa as an important site of knowledge by highlighting teaching, research, and publication work by Syracuse University scholars in the arts, humanities, social and natural sciences, mathematics, engineering, and others. The initiative aims to revitalize interest in Africa, which has been on the wane in many institutions of higher learning since the end of the Cold War. In this respect, it is important to note that Syracuse University once held a vibrant African studies program, although notable resources accumulated during its existence, such as the East African collection at the Byrd Library, remain. Moving forward from this history, the Africa Initiative is building upon this previous experience while charting new directions, including offering a significant pool of experts specializing in various aspects of this diverse and richly endowed continent. The Africa Initiative's presence in the Department of African American Studies reinforces a critical site where most academic work on Africa at Syracuse University is done, and where the continent and the Caribbean are perceived as concomitant parts of the department's Pan-Africanist vision. In bringing together Syracuse University scholars from various disciplines, the Africa Initiative not only promotes interdisciplinary exchange, but also reinforces the university's ongoing effort to diversify and internationalize the educational experiences of our students. As such, the initiative places great emphasis on study abroad programs in Africa, as well as provision of financial resources to give students exposure to that continent. By providing an alternative vision and platform for constructive discourse on Africa and African peoples, the Africa Initiative is helping alter the dominant perception of Africa as a continent ridden with perpetual crises and despair. Now I would like to enjoy the pleasure of introducing the moderator for today's event, Dr. Jeanette S. Julie. Jeanette S. Julie is an associate professor of religion at Syracuse University. She specializes in contemporary Islam, Islam in Europe, anthropology of religion, ethics, religious pluralism and secularism, popular culture, race, and gender. She was a 2011-2012 fellow at Cornell Society for the Humanities. She's also held a postdoctoral position at the Amsterdam Institute for Social Science Research at Amsterdam University, where she did research on the pious Islamic cultural and artistic scene in France and the UK. In 2007, she received her PhD jointly from the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris and the European University of Viadrina in Frankfurt. Jeanette has published in various journals, including Feminist Review, Social Anthropology, and Muslim World. She's currently completing a book manuscript based on the material of her PhD dissertation, provisionally titled Pious Practice and Secular Constraints, Women in the Islamic Revival in France and Germany. Jeanette's research and teaching interests include Islam in Europe, Islamic revivalism, secularism, pluralism, popular culture, moral and aesthetic practices, and gender. So I'll turn this over now to Dr. Julie.
Okay, thank you very much for this introduction. I'm very happy today to be the moderator of this event dedicated to France and Africa. France's approach and relations to the African continent, that is often also called France-Afrique, which is a topic for many of us, source of constant anger, and a topic that continues to be very relevant for many parts of the African continent. So I'm going to start right away introducing the first speaker, Professor Amber Murrey, who's a visiting assistant professor at Clark University. Amber Murrey researches and writes on transformations of life and place amidst structural development and colonial violence, the dynamics of social and political resistance and co-optations of that resistance by state and corporate actors, and hegemonic and counter-hegemonic intellectual practices and knowledge paradigms. Her PhD research on oil, politics, and resistance in Central Africa, as well as her collaborative work on the Pan-African legacy and philosophies of Thomas Sankara, is shaped by a decolonial impetus and conviction that scholarship be active, attentive, accessible, and decolonized. Professor Murrey completed her PhD dissertation, Lifescapes of a Pipe Dream, a decolonial mixtape of structural violence and resistance along the Chad Cameroon oil pipe at Boston College. And she also received an MA in Pan-African Studies from Syracuse University. So let me welcome you, Professor Amber, to give the first presentation today for the next 20 minutes. Thank you.
Sorry, I think I need to unmute before I can screen share for some reason. Thank you very much, Dr. Julie, for that wonderful introduction. Can I confirm that my slides are now visible?
Yes, they are. Thank you.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you so much. That was a wonderful introduction and somehow also a step back in time a bit. I think that bio is a few years old.
Oh, this was the link. I'm sorry, this was the link I was given.
No, please. I enjoyed revisiting that moment in time when I was at Clark.
Okay.
So please, thank you. Yeah, I would like to first thank the audience members very much for joining us. And I would like to express my gratitude for the invitation to speak today. This talk is particularly meaningful to me, given how significantly my scholarship and my politics were shaped by my time as a master's student in Syracuse's Pan-African Studies program. That was in 2009 to 2011, although it seems like yesterday. Thank you very much to Professor Horace Campbell for the invitation to speak, and to Jordan Edward Thomas for all of their assistance with the logistics and the planning of this seminar. I would like to also greet Dr. Yabara-Boukari and to say that it's a real honor to be a panelist alongside you today. So the topic of today's discussion is the role of France in Africa. I'm not going to attempt to deliver an academic paper in our brief time here. Rather, I will offer a series of reflections on the changing role in Africa of France, something that we might liken to the French adage, plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. So the more that it changes, the more that it seems to stay the same. And I think this will be a theme that will reoccur throughout. Many of you will be aware of the term La France Afrique, so named to indicate the particular and close, indeed nearly inseparable, neo-colonial relationship between post-independence African countries and France, in which African leaders, governments, and businesses participate either out of realism or opportunism or anxiety and real fear for economic and political sabotage. The Senegalese novelist Boubacar Boris Diop calls the term, quote, the ultimate symbol of a confiscated, perverted sovereignty. This singular coinage perfectly illustrates France's dogged refusal to decolonize. The term encapsulates a set of illegitimate and sometimes legitimate practices, but practices that subjugate the sovereignty of Francophone African countries. Indeed, as the former French president François Mitterrand famously acknowledged, quote, without Africa, France will have no history in the 21st century. While this includes things like soft power and the promotion of the French language and culture, as we see on this map here, of the some 21 African countries where French is an official language and 5 additional countries where French is commonly spoken, this relationship is, above all, economic. The issue of monetary sovereignty and the persistence of the Central African franc as the currency in 14 West and Central African countries has been the topic of decades of debate, and it reappears in a recent article authored by Dr. Ndongo Samba Sia in the pages of ROPE, the Review of African Political Economy. The CFA, established by the French Ministry of Finance in 1945, is underwritten by the French Treasury, and approximately 500 billion US dollars of African money is held in French banks each year. Today in Côte d'Ivoire, in Cameroon, in Chad, Gabon, Congo, Brazzaville, Senegal, Niger, Benin, Togo, Burkina Faso, or Guinea-Conakry, French multinationals dominate to an average of 70% of the economies, including ports, mines, airports, timber, energy, construction, security systems, media, and telecommunications. These corporations include Total, Bolloré, Arriva, Orange, Carrefour, and many others. Now, a relatively new generation of French presidents would like to publicly turn away from the visage of La France Afrique. Emmanuel Macron, much like the president Nicolas Sarkozy before him, wishes to declare La France Afrique dead. Sarkozy, we will recall, ordered the military use of tanks to dislodge Laurent Gbagbo in Côte d'Ivoire in 2011. And he has now been convicted of charges of corruption and faces more charges currently of campaign finance violation, including allegations of obtaining illegal funding from Gaddafi. So for his part, during a visit to the Université de Ouagadougou in 2017, Macron declared, quote, "I am of a generation where we do not come to tell Africa what to do," end quote. In the same now infamous speech, he boasted that he is of a generation that, quote, "like many of the students in the audience, never knew colonialism." His comprehension of neo-colonialism is clearly very weak. But during that same visit, there were tremors of optimism, namely for this promise to declassify documents related to the assassination of Thomas Sankara on the 15th of October, 1987. So after he made this announcement, I eagerly reached out to Professor Aziz Fall, who has been a longtime activist working with the Sankara family and multiple generations of activists involved in the movement Le Réseau International Justice pour Sankara, Justice pour l'Afrique, International Campaign for Justice for Thomas Sankara. Aziz told me not to hold my breath. Indeed, to date, no documents have been declassified. It has been 33 and a half years since Sankara's assassination. When the family appealed to the UN Committee for Human Rights, they provisionally requested that the state of Burkina Faso clarify the facts behind the assassination, amongst other things. And yet, on the 21st of April, 2008, the UN Committee for Human Rights, in complete contradiction with the preceding decision, closed the record on the case without an investigation having been carried out. During this same visit to Ouagadougou, Macron referred to the country as le pays des hommes intègres, the country of upright people, echoing Sankara's renaming of the country from Upper Volta, a colonial name inherited from the French, to Burkina Faso. The International Campaign for Justice for Sankara has recently released a statement pressing Macron to maintain his promise. They assert, quote, "At a time when the image of France in West Africa is deteriorating, this disrespectful posture towards justice and the Burkinabe people can only reinforce the feeling of mistrust towards France, which extends in particular to Burkina, Mali, and Niger." As Brian Peterson reminds us in his recently published really excellent biography, which I encourage everyone to read, he writes, quote, "There were determined efforts to manipulate the press by the French intelligence. This happened in the years prior to Thomas Sankara's assassination." Peterson writes, quote, "While France may not have engineered Sankara's overthrow from a military standpoint, the French government created the conditions in which a coup was more likely." Indeed, Peterson's work echoes the work of other biographers of Sankara, documenting the tentacles of French influence, including in the military, economy, and political spheres. The French intelligence channels were everywhere, and he documents in particular the large numbers of Burkinabe soldiers who were trained in military schools. And at the same time, a number of graduates of the US's program, the International Military Education and Training Program for the military across the globe, also played a significant role in Blaise Compaoré's coup against Thomas Sankara. So while the French and the US did not intervene directly, perhaps, the provision of military to military aid and the sharing of military intelligence undoubtedly helped to foster the conditions for Sankara's assassination. This is a point echoed by Bruno Jaffrey, another biographer of Thomas Sankara, who documents France's financial, the withdrawal of France's financial support in the months before Sankara's assassination. My colleague Nicholas Jackson has likewise documented the considerable pressures upon Sankara and the revolutionary government to concede to IMF structural adjustment programs. And in Peterson's new book, he discloses a US embassy cable that reveals that Sankara's Minister of Finance had reached out verbally to the IMF's Director for Africa, who at the time was Alassane Ouattara, of course, who's now the president of Cote d'Ivoire, to arrange a meeting in the 2 weeks prior to his assassination. So let's go back to Emmanuel Macron and this idea of the changing visage of France in Africa. Tellingly, in a press conference at a G20 summit in Hamburg, Germany, also in that same year, 2017, Macron claimed, quote, "The challenge for Africa is totally different. It's much deeper. Today, it's civilizational. When countries today have 7 to 8 children per woman, you can decide spending several billion euros on it, but you will not stabilize anything." So while there are public apparitions of seeming shifts in France's African policy, these comments reveal and solidify tired colonial tropes. And everywhere on the continent, we see French support for authoritarian capitalism, even amid half-hearted public attempts to call out repression and persecution. Which was recently the case when Macron promised to censor the Cameroonian president, Paul Biya, for state and military violence in the country's Anglophone region. Yet political actions and economic will continue to foster the conditions for exploitative relations between the state and people, and between the people and corporate capitalist power. I'm not sure how I'm doing on time, and I can't see anyone because I'm sharing my screen. So somebody yell if I'm excessively going over time.
You're still within your time. You still have like almost 7 minutes.
Oh, great. Okay, thank you. So yeah, I'm going to stick with this example of Cameroon for a bit before I conclude. On the 24th of February, 2020, Macron criticized the government of Cameroon for mishandling the Anglophone crisis. Macron made the comments during an informal conversation with a Cameroonian protester in France. This is what the screenshot is here on this slide, who demanded a response to the killing of 22 people and the razing of 9 homes in Ngarba, southwest Cameroon, in the early morning hours of the 14th of February. However, even were Macron's statements against the Cameroonian state's atrocities sincere, anti-French sentiment is so powerful that they were politically irrelevant and, in fact, potentially damaging for peace activists who are working on the ground. Paul Biya, infamously inactive and elusive, quickly opposed Macron's statements through his Secretary General, Ferdinand Ngongo, who claimed, quote, "The Cameroonian president, Paul Biya, is accountable for his actions to the sole sovereign Cameroonian people and not to a foreign leader, even from a friendly country," end quote. In response to Macron's statement, 100 people gathered to protest, well, some 100 people, approximately 100 people, gathered to protest outside the French embassy in Yaoundé, Cameroon's capital. Likely orchestrated by Biya's political party, the RDPC, the protests nevertheless reveal the widespread anti-French and anti-colonial sentiments of Cameroonian youth on both sides of the political aisle. They therefore also reveal the potential repressive dangers of French political intervention, even actions or statements made in the name of peace or against state violence. Skepticism of French policy in Cameroon again came to the fore when a renowned Cameroonian political commentator, Professor Francis Niamsi, spearheaded a petition on the 18th of April 2020, calling for the immediate departure of Christophe Guilou, the French ambassador to Cameroon. He was accused of having organized and editing a video that captured a false hearing with President Biya, because President Biya at the time had been missing, supposedly missing for several months, and had been presumed dead at the time by many activists living in the country, as well as diaspora activists. So this petition to oust the French ambassador to Cameroon reads, quote, "Guilou should depart to reassure the Cameroonian people as to France's desire to finally scrupulously respect the right of the Cameroonian people to democratic sovereignty, which France has flouted since the official decolonization of 1960, which has not yet really been followed by a real structural decolonization. This means monetary, military, geopolitical." End quote. Biya, who has been the president of Cameroon since the 6th of November 1982, is the last remaining African president. The last remaining African president who was placed in power by the departing French colonialists, at the time in the role of Secretary General to the presidency, before he succeeded the country's first president, Amadou Ahidjo, in 1982, when Ahidjo stepped down. Biya has been the president of Cameroon for 39 years. He's maintained his fixed seat in power with the help of a coup-proofing strategy that protects Yaoundé from military threats, decades of military-to-military aid, training, and supplies from France, the US, and Israel, as well as the permanent prosecution and repression of political rivals and allies alike. Cameroonians like to joke that you can find an entire presidential cabinet and governing body within the walls of Yaoundé's Kodingi prison. Everyone but a president. So what can we say of France in Africa? If there's cause for optimism, it's the rise and criticism of France's neo-imperial and extractivist relations with Francophone Africa, in particular from young people and young activists, including the young activists who I work with in Yaoundé. For Flaubert, for example, a 26-year-old university student living in Yaoundé, the economic dominance and political strong arming of La France Afrique has imparted a mistrust and animosity for French political elites. an animosity rivaled only by his derision for Cameroonian political elites. I'd like to conclude by returning to this recent press statement from the International Campaign for Justice for Sankara. The last sentence of this press statement reads, quote, "After the long dark years of the Blaise Compaoré regime, which blocked the progress of justice towards the truth, it is now in France that the blockage lies. It must stop." Great, thank you very much. And I will turn it back over to you.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Murray. And now it's my great honor to introduce our second speaker, Dr. Amzat Yabara-Boukari, who is an independent scholar specializing in African, Caribbean, and Latin American studies. He got a PhD in African history at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales, or School of Advanced Studies in Social Sciences in Paris, with particular interest in Black political and grassroots history. He's a founding teacher of the School of African Politics that opened in Paris in 2018. Amzat is the author of Africa Unite, Une histoire du Panafricanisme, a classic in the study of Pan-Africanism. And he also published the first biography in French on the Guyanese historian Walter Rodney, published in 2018 with Présence Africaine, and also books on Nigeria and Mali. And Amzat is also one of the leading members of the Pan-African League. So it's a great pleasure to hand you now the floor.
Thank you, Jeanette. Thank you for this presentation. I would like to thank everyone, Jordan, Madir, Horace, and the Africa Initiative. Thank you, Amber, for your presentation. That was really interesting. Because I think that when we're speaking of Africa, we are speaking of beast, hydra, that is a mythical animal that have several heads, and when you cut one head, another one is coming. And this is the vision that we need to have from vision of multiple connections that are coming from France, that are leading to the Caribbean, the Indian Ocean, to Africa, and everywhere. It's a global system. And this global system has a very long story that starts in the 16th century in the Caribbean with the first colonial empire that was birthed after the Haitian Revolution in 1804. And a second empire was built from 1830 on the colonization of Algeria. And the second empire still remains today under the France-Afrique. So French colonialism has a very long history. And we cannot distinguish French colonialism and French racism, because racism is structural in the neo-colonial, the French neo-colonial system. When you're looking at the French political system from the left to the right, you can find the France-Afrique everywhere, left in the right, in the middle. And when you're looking specifically in the middle, that is where Emmanuel Macron says that it is part of, you can take a comparison. You can draw a comparison between Emmanuel Macron and another one French president that was Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, who used to be the youngest French president before Emmanuel Macron in the Fifth Republic. Both of them belong to the monetary system. They were working in banking and they were making money. And in 1974, when Valéry Giscard d'Estaing became French president, he decided to reorganize the neo-colonial system, and he left the old friend of Charles de Gaulle, Jacques Foccart, and he decided to focus on the economic interest, French economic interest. And I think that the position of Emmanuel Macron today is a little bit the same. but it is guided by a new geopolitical situation. We need to understand that the colonial system is in crisis. The neo-colonial system is in crisis. It is contested by other foreign powers. Today we can speak of China, for example, but yesterday we were speaking of the USSR and the United States. It is also attacked by a new generation of mass movements, Africa, popular uprising in Africa. And we are also in a period of repression and economic and political reforms all over the world. So we are in a period of huge contradiction between the so-called democratic discourse of France and the specific repression of the neo-colonial system. And we need to get these two points in comparison to understand how it works. We also need to focus on the balance of power between France and Africa. Because in 1958, when independence was given to African countries, it was a so-called independence, but it was given because the demographic power of African colonies was getting over France's demographics. And the issue of demography is still relevant today in the way France is working with our ancient colonies. Under Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, there was a Ministry of Foreign Affairs whose name was Louis de Guéringaud. He used to say that Africa is the only place where France can maintain its power with only 300, 400, 500 soldiers. And he explained why Africa was at the size of France, economically speaking, culturally speaking, and politically speaking. And in those times, in the middle of the 70s, the target was specifically to counter the Soviet-Cuban influence in Southern Africa. And France was using its colonial position in the Indian Ocean, for example, La Réunion, Mayotte, and also Djibouti, to take a role in the new militarization of Africa in relation with the support to the apartheid regime. So we have to understand how France used its colonial position all over Africa to get a role in African geopolitics today. Louis de Guéringaud was also very important because he changed the way the French diplomacy understood Africa. Before Giscard d'Estaing and de Guéringaud, French diplomacy was working with Francophone Africa and the rest of Africa. But when he came in power in 1974, they decided to divide Africa. They say that North Africa belongs to the Mediterranean policy, not African policy. And Sub-Saharan Africa needs to be divided between West Africa, Central and Eastern Africa, and Southern Africa. And this division is really important to understand because it's a kind of redefinition of French interest in Africa, meaning that most of the French interests in Africa today are not in the ancient colonies in the Francophone Africa, but specifically in Nigeria, in Angola, in South Africa, and in Ethiopia. And they needed to change their approach of Africa to get along with the new economic interest at that time. And I think that with Macron today, we are coming back to this vision, saying that France-Afrique is over because we are not working specifically with Francophone Africa. And this is really problematic because France is the only country that developed an asymmetrical relation with a whole continent. And it was built under Valéry Giscard d'Estaing. Under Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, they started to travel officially in other countries out of the precaries. And this redefinition of the perimeter of the France is really actual, because in 2020, Macron decided to organize the year of Africa, the Saison Africa France 2020. And from the beginning, he explained that he was not born in the times of colonization, and he spent his internship in Nigeria, Lagos, in New Africa, and he wanted to speak with African youth. And Macron is the youngest French president, and his discourse is the discourse of a very, very old French president. And this is really interesting, because in his way of talking to Africans, he got this very paternalistic way that is associated with a racist vision of Africa. Always speaking to African youth. There are no adults, there are no intellectual, only youth. And this erasure of any contestation in Africa belongs to a psychological domination that we need to address. The way we write African history. And right now in France, one of the main debates is about the return of stolen artifacts. It's also about the opening of colonial archives. So it's dealing with issues of memory, issues of the past. But those issues have the very important impact on nowadays relationships. We can also speak of the role of France during the Tutsi genocide in Rwanda. All those issues explain why we have also in France right now a new contestation, a new generation of French African militant activists that are linking their situation as Black in France with the way France is treating the African continent. And we have a third issue that we need to keep in mind, is that France is still a colonial power with a position, especially in the Caribbean. So we need to understand the French colonialism from the metropolitan area in Europe that is dealing with the children of former colonized countries, the French colonialism in the Caribbean and in the overseas, the so-called French overseas, that is part of the way French military position can readjust in the world. And third, we need to talk about the division, the French neo-colonial division of Africa. In the Francophone Africa, that is strictly connected to French domination with the monetary domination, with the cultural imperialism, because most of the African elite was trained in the French academies. Most of the cultural production is linked to the French cultural hegemony. So we also have the military domination in those former French colonies. And in the rest of the African continent, France is using those Francophone countries to export her domination. And this is the way we need to understand the debate on the reform of the franc CFA. The way it was decided to leave the franc CFA, to create ECO, that was the ECOWAS currency. But on our position, a Pan-Africanist position, whether it be ECO built by the French imperialism or an ECO built by ECOWAS, is still an imperialist currency. So we need also to find some alternatives. And the issue of alternative is really important, because we are speaking do we need an alternative or an alternation? And we need also to understand that Africa is funding French politics. All the French political parties took money from Africa, whether it was through French multinational, Total, Elf, Bolloré, etc., whether it was through African head of states. They were really proud to say that they were giving money to French political parties, except the communists. Because when France-Afrique was built, it was strictly forbidden for African leaders to work with communism, because France-Afrique is also part of the war against communism, like today the war against terrorism. So all those issues are connected. And today, I think that one of the main points is how do we deal with this old system that is tumbling, but it's still regenerating? How do we deal with this hydra? And this is what we are trying to organize. That is to say, a kind of general collective mobilization on several issues that need to understand the way French also imposed on African states the model of the nation states that is not adapted to us. How do we connect? How do we build new internationalism? And this is why I am especially interested that we organized this event with the Department of African American Studies, because African American has a role in the story of fighting French colonialism and other imperialism in Africa. Because we need to understand that we are in situations that are more connected than we think. And this issue is really important because in July 2021, there will be the next France-Afrique Summit in Montpellier in the south of France, the city where Mariam Sankara is living right now. And for this Africa-France Summit, Emmanuel Macron does not want to invite African head of states. He understood that African youth is angry against African head of states. So he's dealing with African intellectuals, African artists, African diaspora. So he selected numbers of people, of association, organization that are part of this new discourse upon Africa. And this France-Afrique summit is a little bit the same as what Barack Obama organized in 2010, August 2010, when he invited in Washington civil society leaders from Africa for the 15th anniversary of African independence. So we can see the way French imperialism is also looking at how the US organize their own imperialism. So I think that this vision, this global vision, needs to be studied, needs to be investigated, because we get connection. If we speak of France CFA, one part is linked to the French treasury, but another one is linked to the IMF, the World Bank, and the American interest. And we know that in 1994, when the currency was evaluated, the US knew before the French that it would be evaluated. So, to conclude, I would say that the issue of France-Afrique and France in Africa is not only France in Africa. It's larger. It's France in Caribbean, it's France in the Indian Ocean, in the Pacific with the New Caledonia, and it's also France and Africa inside the French metropolitan area. And all those issues belong to the colonial pact that was engaged in the 17th centuries, meaning that all the economic, commercial, and monetary transactions need to be controlled by the heart of the Eden. This is why Emmanuel Macron is a very specific president, a little bit like Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, with the issue of rethinking a new French imperialism that is also supported by Africans themselves without they understand that they are part of this, their own domination. So we need to read again Frantz Fanon. We need to read again Amilcar Cabral. We need to understand how this system was built, and we also need to understand that we are in a very interesting period because we have a series of crises, a series of contradictions, and we need to take advantage of this specific situation.
Thank you so much for another really insightful talk. As I said in the beginning, I mean, this is an exasperating topic. I'm opening now the floor to questions. You can either unmute yourself and just present them by yourself, or if you prefer, you can also put them in the chat and then I can read them aloud. That's up to you. And thank you also for both speakers to sticking so much to your time. You made my task very easy. Yes, Peter Castro.
Yes, thank you to both speakers for very enlightening talks. I really learned a lot. And I was a question for both of you, perhaps. If you could say something about the French role in Mali, which reminds me a lot of the United States role in Afghanistan, where as a country they just don't seem to want to pull out of, and I don't know what kind of role they're playing there. So I'd be very interested in hearing what you have to say. Thank you.
Do we answer right now? Or?
Yeah, you can just go ahead.
Yeah. I think the role of France in Mali is not new because France has a fascination for the Sahara Desert. The Grand Sahara is part of the French mythology. Conquest of this huge desert is very important. And in the Second World War, it was from Chad, close to Mali, that France got its salvation with the French army from the Chad who freed the metropolitan. But later, when the Algeria War was declared, the situation of Mali was really important, and the project, the French colonial project, was to cut North Mali from south of Algeria and to create a new state. It was called l'Organisation Commune des Régions Sahariennes, Saharian Area Communal Organization, and it was supposed to be given to Tuareg. But finally, the Mali president, Modibo Keïta, was a nationalist and who worked with Léopold Sédar Senghor from Senegal, refused that his country would be divided in two. And he expelled in 1960 the French army, and he did not sign any military agreement with France. So in 1968, Modibo Keïta was overthrown by Moussa Traoré, a general who was a puppet of France, and who re-engaged Mali in the Franc CFA. And in 1991, there was a huge popular movement that overthrew Moussa Traoré with Atité. And later, we have the return of democracy with Omar Konaré. So Mali was a kind of model of democratic transition in the 90s. But in 2012, there was a coup that was linked to the deterioration of the security situation in the Sahel, clearly linked to the war in Libya, and the Malian state was absolutely failed. And France used this situation that was really known from the French intelligentsia, to launch the several operations with under the umbrella of the United Nations. And when President François Hollande arrived in Bamako, he said that it was the most beautiful day of my political life. Is what he said when he arrived in Bamako, because he saved Mali. So we also have this vision of the white saviors, the French save the Africans, and so on. So there was a very negative discourse on the situation. And France signed military agreement at this time with Mali in 2014, with the general who is now the provisional head of state of Mali. And from this moment on, France installed their military bases in Mali, and one part of the occupation is linked to the resources, the natural resources, and another one is supposed to fight terrorism in the Sahel. But we know that the French military presence is perceived like an army of occupation by most of the Mali population. So the role of France in Mali is really problematic, and we need to address it. We'll stop here if Amber wants to add some information.
Thanks for the question. Yeah, I mean, I think that response is really comprehensive. And yeah, I liked the situating of this conflict within the idea of French mythologies. And not only French mythologies, but also American counterinsurgency mythologies, which follow very closely this trend of militarism across the African continent, but in particular the Sahel. And of course, Horace Campbell, who's on this call, was the one who introduced me to the brilliant work of Jeremy Keenan, who has traced this mythology in his book, The Dark Sahara, where he talks about the counterinsurgency doctrine of, this a banana theory of terrorism across the Sahel, to ridiculize the mythology in the early 2000s. But yeah, I mean, France's militarism, some 3,500 troops currently stationed across the African continent, and so. I think actually what's also interesting about the case of Mali is that it's not that interesting in the context of France's other militarisms. And so, I mean, we can look at Chad in 2008, Cote d'Ivoire in 2011, where it's either intelligence sharing or direct interventions sponsored by the French. And also the knowledge of that sponsorship creates an enormous distrust. And so when, just maybe a month ago or so on my social media feed, a lot of Cameroonian activists were posting videos of French helicopters in the Central African Republic. I mean, we don't know if these videos are verified. At least I didn't, follow up with it. But in this context, I was just thinking, well, this speculation is well-founded. And that's kind of the history of distrust.
Thank you very much. We have two more very interesting and probably also questions that take a little bit of time to answer in the chat. So I'm going to read the first one. One area that I want the panelists to shed light on is how France has stunted regional cooperation and integration among African countries at the continental and sub-regional levels. Perhaps one of you can talk a little bit about that, and then I'll ask the next question for the interest of time.
Well, I think I can take that one, since the next one I think is directed at Dr. Boukari Yabara. So yeah, I mean, almost at every level. And what came out really strongly in the other presentation was in particular France's motivations to quell socialism, anything like communism, anything like a state structure that would, you know, support the well-being of the masses of the people. And that has been probably, in my opinion, the most disastrous way in which the French have intervened to, you know, to try systematically to either violently or through other means, quell alternatives to, you know, kind of the capitalist status quo. And I mean, a really good example of that is obviously the sabotage, the political economic sabotage of Thomas Sankara in the 1980s, which is an excellent example of someone who presented a radical alternative. And, you know, yet the kind of French political operations and shady kind of backroom deals really ostracized him from other leaders on the African continent.
Thank you so much, Professor Murray. And then perhaps for Amzat or for Dr. Boukari Yabara to be uniformous. So the question concerning Jacques Foccart, de Gaulle's Africa man who helped construct France-Afrique. Rob Prince says, as I understand it, in exchange for formal independence, Foccart imposed secret agreements on the emergent independent states to give France control of countries' economic and military systems. Are any of those secret agreements available? Have any of them been made public so far?
Yes, Foccart died in 1997, and a few scholars got access to his archives. One of them I'm working with is Jean-Pierre Bat, and they published several books about the Foccart system. And what we need to understand is that Foccart was really close to Charles de Gaulle. He was Secretary General in charge of African affairs. And with this position that was unique in the French Republic, he could organize many things. And those things that he organized were part of the secret agreements. One of them is the assassination of any African leaders that opposed to French domination. Assassination is the last solution, but before assassination, he organized a vast system of corruption with many African leaders. He also trained one of his close African allies, that was Félix Houphouët-Boigny from Côte d'Ivoire. And Foccart organized the French intelligence, the French service in Africa, with many gangsters that were part also from the private securities of French multinationals. So he was at the center of a huge underground system that was not so underground. And this is something that is really important, because we are speaking of secret agreements, but in fact, there is nothing secret. Everything is on the table. Sometimes it is so big that we can't see it. And this is what is really interesting, because we have a vision of France-Afrique like something a little bit dirty, something a little bit unofficial. But we need to understand that it is an official policy of the French since the 50s, since it was decided that France must decolonize, but this decolonization must be made in the French interest. So this is really important to understand. So they put in power all the African leaders that were against the idea of African independence. And those leaders were locked with specific conditions that were written in the secret agreements. One of them was, for example, the private access of France to the natural resource of all former colonies, the exclusivity of the French military presence all over those countries. Also, the imposition of a kind of how can I say, private relation between those African head of states and General de Gaulle. So we need to understand that secret agreements is also linked to personal relations that were organized by Jacques Foccart with African and French political and economic figures.
Thank you so much. We have another question from Jordan. What is the activism like on the ground in France in regard to French activity in Africa? Is there solidarity among activists? Furthermore, is their activism perceived as both the communautarisme and racisme anti-blanc by the French media? That's a good question.
One difficulty is that French people are not really aware of what is happening in Africa. They don't know what the French army is doing in Africa. They don't know what is happening in the French Caribbean. In the Caribbean, we have a very strong colonial situation since many years, and nobody heard of it in France. 10 years ago, there was huge manifestation, demonstration in the French Caribbean, and it was only shown by US television. And when it was France, it was the censorship. We have a kind of a division of the different activist camps. And here in France, we have the African diaspora that are taking the streets every weekend, or protesting against France's presence in Africa. But it's divided between each African diaspora, Mali, Senegal, Cameroon, etc. Not really united. On the other side, we have Black French movement, popular movement, underground movements that are demonstrating on the same day about French racism, about state violence. But there is no connection between what the army is doing in Africa and how those people are treated by the French police system. So we need to build this connection and to take also the condition of the French Caribbean. That is a truly colonial situation. The real colonial situation is the one of the French Caribbean. The Africans are in a neo-colonial situation. And all those struggles, all those revendications, we need to build, I think, a platform that can only be a Pan-African platform. So this is what we are trying to organize right now. But it's difficult because some of them are French citizens, and they don't see their life anywhere out of France. So they're struggling for integration in the French system. Some others want to repatriate in Africa. So we also have the difficulty that the French system is assimilationist and in the same time targeting by the issue of separatism. So this is very complicated, and I think that we are really in a huge colonial situation in every side of the struggle.
Yes, thank you very much. I think this is a really important point you made. Also, this separation of groups. I think that is really central in understanding the difficulties of overcoming that and these parallels of internal colonial situation against the, what this organization, Les Indigènes de la République, called the Indigènes, right? And then, of course, people in Africa as the, still the indigene from there. So, and it's of course interesting also to think about the, this systemic fight right now against decolonial theories there, right? So I think there's a whole, thing that this question kind of brings up in terms of, points. But we have another question that will take us again in a different direction, also for Dr. Boukari-Yabara. You mentioned that we need to be vigilant about the ECOWAS currency that is meant to replace the CFA. Can you please expand? And then for Dr. Murrey, you mentioned the large presence of French MNCs in Africa. How do we challenge entrenched companies like Total? So first for Dr. Boukari-Yabara.
Yeah, in fact, in 1945, France created a colonial currency, the that is the friend of French colonial Africa, that was renamed at the time of African independence, but stayed the colonial currency until now. And this currency is divided in three parts. One is in West Africa, so it's the former West African French colonies. Another one is in Central Africa. The third one is in Comoros, in the Indian Ocean. And in 2013, there was a report written by several French and African economists. One is Lionel Zinsou, also, and Jean-Michel Severino, and Hubert Védrine, who said that it was time for France to leave the franc CFA because the franc CFA is not adapted to fight the Chinese presence in Africa. And we need to understand that the franc CFA is a huge scandal because it brought lots of money to France, the system. So France controlled this money, made this money. This money is made in France. And the African countries use this money and they must give at least 50% of the receipt to the French Treasury. And in exchange, the French Treasury maintained the stability of the money. One word very important in the neo-colonial system is of stability. Money stability, political system stability. This is why we have African president for 20, 25, 30, 40 years, because stability is the meaning of maintenance of French interest. So this money, this currency is not adapted to a ultra-liberal way of recolonization of Africa. China is making it right now. So in 2013, they decided to enlarge the French monetary zone, using, especially in West Africa, Ghana, and targeting Nigeria, because Nigeria is the real enemy of France in West Africa. France wants to take more parts on the Nigerian markets. France CFA is not really interesting to attack the Nigerian market. So they decided, while the FAFA was also hugely contested by the youth, to take an African project of monetary, a common monetary zone that was supposed to be named ECO. And France decided to turn the franc CFA, to change the name in the name of ECO, that was the name of the money that was supposed to be launched by African states. So it triggered a kind of diplomatic war between France and the other non-Francophone countries like Nigeria, who say that we cannot takes this money right now, because France would still get a control in the organization of this monetary system. So right now we are still in the old franc CFA, and there is no specific vision to get out of this situation. There are many debates. Some of them, like Ndongo Masila, says that we need to, in each country, to take a national currency. We need to cut the notion of collective currency. Others are saying that we need national currency. So there are many debates. But what we need to know is that France has a solution, a neo-colonial solution for each African proposition. So we need to find the one that will be the best to our own interest. This is what we need to address right now, not to only focus on what France wants or what France wants to do, what we as Africans want to do, because the monetary issue is linked to many other problematics. I think that if as African we have our own money, but our leaders are still puppets of Paris, it will change nothing. So the political control is central, and it reminds us that Kwame Nkrumah used to say that we need to secure first the political kingdom. And right now, the debate is only about monetary and economic issue, but it is a political issue. So we are in a kind of dead-end debate for a few years, and I hope that we can find a solution in the next years, but it can only be a political solution.
Okay, thank you very much. Dr. Murrey, could you comment on the other question on the presence of French MNCs in Africa?
Yeah, well, first I wanted to just briefly touch on Jordan's question, which was about activists in France, because that's a portion of my work is following a Cameroonian diaspora group, the Brigade Anti-Sardinat, which is the brigade of against sardines. And this is a diaspora collective that has emerged in the last couple of years, which uses kind of critical diaspora spaces either in France, sometimes in Switzerland, in Germany, in the United States. And they have targeted demonstrations either at places that have ties to Paul Biya, or in 2019, they had a targeted demonstration outside of the Cameroonian embassy in Paris, and they actually managed to occupy the embassy for many hours, and the whole thing was live streamed. But Brigade Anti-Sardinat, anti-sardines, because they call members of the RDPC, which is the ruling party, sardines. So it's a kind of comical name on the basis that Paul Biya, in his kind of patronage and in his campaigns, he famously gives out cans of sardines as a kind of way to encourage people to vote for him. And so they say, "Quand tu as goûté les sardines, tu es dans les sardines." Like when you kind of like a cat, if you've you've eaten the sardine, it's gone to your brain. So the diaspora space in France is really important. Although, yeah, I would echo the other points about whether or not these are Pan-African solidarities is questionable. Yeah, the issue of not just French corporations, but corporations in African countries is obviously a question of the century. And if we knew how they could be resisted more effectively, particularly in a neoliberal era when, so a lot of my work has been with people in Cameroon who live along the Chad-Cameroon oil pipeline. And one of the complaints is that on ne sait même pas quelle porte cogner. Like, this was a project that was supported by the World Bank with the consortium of a Malaysian oil firm, Petronas, with Chevron, with Exxon, you know, and has since expanded to include dozens of other oil corporations. And so, the kind of neoliberal fracturing of extractive capitalism renders resistance incredibly challenging for people on the ground, because they really don't know what door to knock on when they're resisting. Do we go to the World Bank? Do we go to our chief? Do we go to someone in Yaoundé? Or who should we go to? And then also corporations and corporate interests profit off of that to play the blame game amongst themselves. And so, they will always pass the buck to one or the other to say, oh, well, it's not us. It was actually, and these conversations are always racialized and deeply racist, and the trope of the failed state and the African leadership deficit is perpetually called upon by corporate interests to justify their extractive actions and to say, we were trying to be more compassionate, but, et cetera, et cetera. There's also this question about Laurent Gbagbo, which I think is a really interesting question in the chat, about whether or not the fact that he was at The Hague for 9 years, but eventually was acquitted. Is this a victory for, does this signal that he resisted La France Afrique? And he's continued to stay in Europe. Would his eventual return to Cote d'Ivoire signal a blow to La France Afrique in the region? A really complicated issue, but I think that no. The fact that Laurent Gbagbo and Charles Blé Goudet, who was the Minister of Youth and Sport at the time, who was also tried with him at the ICC. I think that it actually signals the strength of imperial power, that they were held for so long and acquitted. And as part of that, it wasn't that Gbagbo is simply remaining on in Europe because he so loves it. He's not allowed to return to Cote d'Ivoire. And Blé Goudet was also tried in a court in Cote d'Ivoire and sentenced to some 20 years in prison. And so, Laurent Gbagbo, I don't think he's also a superhero of Pan-Africanism or, someone who is staunchly against La France Afrique in the first place. So no, I don't think that it signals that he was able to resist La France Afrique.
Okay, great. So we are more or less coming towards the end of the seminar, the roundtable.
Can I ask some questions?
Oh yeah, of course.
Yes, I wanted to ask 2 questions. And the first was about a projection of the weakness of France, that the echo was not only in response to what happened in 2013, but because the Germans, who ultimately dominate Europe, are worried about France's failures in Africa, and therefore the Germans have become much more active in Africa, and therefore are pushing the echo to undermine France's role. And therefore, the reconstitution of the European project through France was a consolidation in that sense. That's the first part of my question. And the second part of my question was for the future, because France is inordinately poor, and what their activities in West Africa now depends on the United States of America, because the United States of America has no military collaboration with the French. Now, the extent to which the radical movement in the United States of America gains traction in the United States and force the anti-racist project in the United States? To what extent do we have in Pan-Africanists like Amzat or Amber an alternative project for collaboration in those zones between people who speak French and in the global anti-racist and anti-imperialist movement? Do we have a project which is beyond France and anti-racist? Literally, how are we envisioning this project? Can we consider such a project?
Yes, I think we definitely need to engage in a new internationalism. I think it's really important. Many people, many African youth I'm working with are looking at the way countries like Venezuela are resisting to US imperialism. Many African youth are looking at the way the world is going on. We have a situation where effectively France is not so strong as it pretends to be. I think it's really important to understand it. France is a very small country. It did not have the means of ambition. It wants to show as a superpower, but it's a really small power. And it is dependent on the German, on the US, and even on the Chinese. They are trying to get some Chinese cooperation in Africa. And they're also dealing with the One Belt, One Road project of globalization from the Chinese. So I think that we have one project that is clearly historical, that is a project Eurafrique project that was part of the old European geopolitics, saying that the Mediterranean Sea should be the heart of this global civilization. And we know that when it was fought in the 20s, there were also works of science fiction saying that when Europe will not be, when it will not be possible to live in Europe for climatic reasons, Europeans will migrate in Africa. We need to secure places in Africa. So this is science fiction, but we know what science fiction is when we're speaking of this kind of project. We know that Chinese are buying lands in Africa. We know that everyone is in Africa right now, thinking about what we will be in 15 or 100 years. We definitely need on the African side to get this global vision and this historical vision. I think that the French situation is very specific because it developed for many years a kind of, how can I say, hypocritical friendship with Africans. And France pretends to be the friend of Africa. They say that they know Africans better than Africa knows themselves, finally. So we need also to engage, I think, the psychological assimilation. This is really important if we want to get a break, rupture, and we also know to use, I think, the European division to engage an African vision. What we need is a European policy by African and Pan-African to exploit the European division, like Toussaint Louverture in the Haitian Revolution used the division between French, the Spanish, and the British to liberate Santo Domingo from slavery, and later Dessalines took the independence. So we need to look at the contradiction between all the imperialism, and German imperialism is part of it. Regarding how could we build a project, global project, dealing with anti-racism, with anti-imperialism and Pan-Africanism, I think it's a long story. that is quite impossible if we are not connecting our different grassroots movements, our different organizations, if we cannot define our own situation in each context of the world. And from this field work, we need to find the Achilles heels of the imperialist system. This is really important. And one of its weakness in the imperialist world is the dependency to the natural resources. So we need to engage African workers, African peasants. We need to think about the mode of production that is dealing with Africa today, and to engage the world economic relation. I think that we need to get global vision, some local position, and some connection between the local and the global, without being too small, without being big. So on my mind, it's only a matter of time. And if we keep the distance, keep the intellectual struggle, if we keep the connections from one part to another one, something should come. But the difficulty is that we are divided among ourselves. So we have many Africans who want to work with France. Many Black people want to be French before everything. So the issue of identity must also be put on the table. There are people who say that North Africa is not Africa, etc. So we need also to engage those issues that are really divisive, and to find, I think, a specific definition of Pan-Africanism that is not necessarily a new definition. I think that in the past, in our historical experience, we have everything, but we need to take the tools, we need to take ingredients from our historical experience to build something new today.
So is there time still?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Yeah, we have about 7 minutes.
I couldn't find that.
Okay, great. Well, I think what I would say in response to this is to emphasize, perhaps, in addition to what's already been said, the role and the importance of education. And I do mean primary, secondary, and tertiary education. And, oh, someone's in the waiting room. So, I mean, Horace, of course, will know this, that one of my first academic appointments was at Jimma University in Jimma, Ethiopia. And there we had at the university no department of politics. And so I was in a department of governance and development. And really what we did under the auspices of governance and development, me and some of my more critical colleagues, was to teach political history. But the kind of rise and the dominance of notions of entrepreneurship and neoliberal economic doctrine and decades of underfunding of the critical social sciences and the humanities across the continent in higher education has really, I think, played a profound impact on how people envision possible futures. And so the role, I think, of education and really supporting critical scholars on the continent, not, there are many in the diaspora, is a point that's really important. And then, I mean, I would just say that, in considering this project and the alternative, One thing, you know, of course, that also that we're recognizing is the forms of permanent repression and the deep obstacles to peaceful demonstration of any kind. And so, you know, for the activists that I work with in Yaoundé, they see videos of intentional maiming by security forces of 17-year-old kids who are marching, you know, peacefully to demonstrate against, you know, Paul Biya and authoritarianism. And so the obstacles are also enormous. This kind of, you know, systematic forms of repression, violent and infrastructural repression as well, because even as, you know, spaces have opened up in social media, those spaces have also been foreclosed. And so activists in Cameroon have been charged with cyber terrorism. And this is, you know, something that we have seen in Chad, in Egypt, you know, many places are the kind of shutting down of the digital realm, which, you know, especially in the Arab Spring had been an important counter space for peaceful exchange and the kind of articulation of different futures that you're talking about, Horace. Yeah, and then I guess just one final point about the ways that, you know, the repression and forms of sabotage have been the persistence of divide and rule tactics by you know, repressive governments. And so we, you know, we see in Cameroon this very targeted kind of ethnicization of political issues that is inaccurate, right? And so it's a way in which alternatives are delegitimized as, oh, you know, it's just Bamileke people, or, oh, those are just, you know, Les Nordistes, or those are just, you know, Anglophone peoples. When you speak to activists and those divisions are not concrete and those divisions are not real, and that is not how they understand themselves. And yet that's constantly the barrage that appears in state media. Yeah, so I guess I really listed more of the challenges, unfortunately, but yeah, looking forward to continuing that conversation.
Yes, thank you so much. I think this is extremely important. I mean, if you see the demonstrations of people throughout Africa and the kind of tanks and militarized police they encounter, which has dramatically grown over the last 10 years, I mean, really dramatically, it is very, very worrying and preoccupying. Yes. Thank you so much. I'm not sure, Mahda, how we are in time. Should I conclude slowly? Yeah. So yeah, thank you. This was a great debate with, you know, much food for thought about the challenges, the hopes. You have to say optimist. And this is, I think, probably a topic that the Pan-African Studies program will address in the future, because it's not going away. So I don't know if Mahda or Jordan, you want to make some announcement for next meetings. Then I'm handing the mic to you, and I'm done.
Okay, thank you. Before you do that, could I move a vote of thanks?
Yes.
Okay. It is now after 11:30 in Paris and after 10:30 in Oxford. So let me say that the Africa Initiative is very poor, and we did not have the financial resources to ask these people to speak. So we want to thank them very much because it is a representation of their commitment to the Pan-African struggle. I have known Amzat nearly 20 years, and you could see from the work that he's done as a Pan-Africanist, starting with Walter Rodney, that his work is very comprehensive, and he sees the link between colonialism in the Caribbean and the oppression in France. So Amzat, thank you for, and I'm sure your work will continue with our work that we're doing at the global level, not only in the Caribbean, but in all parts of Africa. So I want to thank you very much. I also want to thank Amber Murrey because Amber is an example of what a Pan-Africanist who was trained properly. Here is someone who comes from Idaho, but now is a leader in the Pan-African world and who has taken up the question of Sankara and African freedom. And she is becoming an intellectual leader among the Pan-Africanists. And I can say that when I met Amber, she was in our Pan-African program. She was already on a progressive trajectory. But I would say, I want to say this to Jordan and to Mahi, that this is what can happen. In other words, this is what comes out of our program. And I think, Jordan, you are making very important connections here with Amzat in terms of your work. So let me thank Amber. And Amber, please send the love from the African Initiative to your children who were born in Syracuse, that we still remember them. Let me thank all the members of the board of African Initiative who are there. I see many of them here. And I really want to thank the students who have come out, because we have many of the students who are trying to study and understand Africa. And we want to thank the large audience who come from many different parts of the world. We saw Goshu in Australia who came on. So I want to thank everybody. We don't have a lot of resources, but we have committed people like Jordan and Mahi, whose leadership we're going to work with, so that Mahi and Jordan are the new leaders of the African Initiative who are working with the board of the African Initiative. And thank you so much for chairing. You're the newest member of the African Initiative. We plan to work with you. And Jeanette, although you're in Cornell, you as a member of the faculty of Syracuse, we want to thank you so much for coming forward. And I want to now give it back over to Mahi and Jordan.
Thank you, Walimo. In that spirit of gratitude, I also want to thank you, who have not only been a teacher to most people in this conference room right now, but have also preserved this space and preserved African Initiative with other board members who are here today for discussions like this to carry on. So I want to thank you. And on that note, I want to thank everybody who participated today, both our speakers. I want to reiterate the thank you. I think it was a great event in terms of historicizing France's role and also globalizing the struggle that's ongoing on the ground in Africa against imperialism. So thank you again. In April, we will have another event. African Initiative is doing another event on Libya. And so I will be sending out, Jordan and myself will be sending out emails in regards to the promotion once we have a confirmed date in April. But yeah, thank you again, everybody. And thank you, Jordan. So he's the one who took charge on this event, so I want to give it up to him. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much again for the invitation. It was really a pleasure.
Thank you, Dr.
Amber, please keep in touch. We should have a Skype discussion sometime soon. We're still going to unite Africa with our water transfer system.